Story 1. I've been a trucker for close to 15 years now. This happened to me in 2017. I was driving an overnight haul through the Mojave Desert in California, headed for a destination in Arizona. I think I was delivering appliances. I don't really remember. It was pitch black, darkness in every direction. The headlights on my semi were really dim at the time, and I'd been putting off getting them fixed forever. Usually I couldn't tell the difference, but since there were basically no other cars on the road, it was much more obvious. I remember having to strain my eyes every few minutes to make out the road in the distance. That could have been a horror story in itself. I was debating pulling over for a couple of hours and waiting for sunrise, but I didn't want to waste my time. I desperately needed the money at the time, so I kept driving even though it wasn't fully safe. I figured since it was basically a straight line, it would be okay. I think it was about an hour before sunrise when I saw something approaching fast in the distance. Worried about hitting an animal, I slammed on the brakes. As my truck screeched to a stop, I realized what was in front of me, a car with its hazards on. The weird thing was that it was in the exact middle of the road, like literally on the double yellow. What was even weirder was that the passenger door was wide open. My truck stopped maybe a foot before hitting it. Not to toot my own horn, but I'm a pretty fearless guy and I know my way around a bar fight. Because of this, I wasn't really scared when I saw the car. I was more curious than anything. I thought maybe someone needed a jump or something, so I reversed the semi and pulled over. I thought about throwing some flares down, but decided against it since I hadn't seen a single other car on the road besides this one. I got out of my truck and made my way over to the car. It was a warm, still night. I remember thinking how strange it was that there was almost no wind. It was also really quiet that night. The faint click of the hazards was the only sound in what felt like the entire desert. I got a little closer to the car. I vividly remember that it was a new-looking red Ford Fusion. I approached the car a little cautiously. Like I said, the passenger door was wide open. I walked around the car and stopped in my tracks. It was completely empty. I made sure of it too, checking the back seat and anywhere someone might be laying down. There was literally no one inside. All of a sudden, I was much less sure about the situation. I was expecting someone to need help of some sort. Maybe even someone who took a nap in a really dumb spot. I certainly wasn't expecting this, though. The car was literally empty. I cast a few glances over my shoulder, feeling a lot more uneasy now. I kept whipping my head around, looking in every direction. I felt like someone was going to charge me or something. The problem was, it was so dark that I couldn't see that far in front of me, except for what was lit up by my truck's headlights. It was eerie. I waited a while longer, thinking about getting back in my truck and forgetting about this whole thing. Someone was out there somewhere. Against my better judgment, I decided to keep investigating. I looked inside the car, but everything seemed completely normal. The key was even in the ignition, although the engine was turned off. I got back out of the car and made my way over to the trunk. Might as well have a look, I figured. I went to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Locked. I grabbed the key out of the ignition and unlocked the trunk. Still though, the thing wouldn't budge. It was jammed from the inside somehow. I opened the back door and tried getting at the trunk through the back seat. To my surprise, it actually opened. There were 3 squished garbage bags back there, along with a rope that was tying the trunk closed. I remember glancing one more time over my shoulder before reaching for them. The coast was clear. I must have been within 5 inches from one of the bags when the loudest gunshot I've ever heard rang out into the night. I slammed my head on the roof of the car in shock. I didn't even think. I threw the keys on the front seat and got out of the car as fast as I could. As I was climbing into my semi, I heard a grungy voice yelling in the distance. He yelled "hey" a bunch of times, and his voice seemed to be quickly approaching. I scrambled into the semi and turned it on. I threw it in gear as fast as I could. I remember cursing a bunch of times as the engine initially stalled. And that's when I saw it. As my truck began pulling out, I saw a person standing at the trunk of the car. It was a short, husky guy with red hair. He was wearing overalls and shin-high boots. In his left hand, he was holding a small shovel. In his right, though, was an old-looking hunting rifle. We locked eyes for a few seconds as my truck began to drive past him. He didn't move. I remember him not looking crazy or anything. He had this worried look on his face. As I passed him, he dropped his shovel and started waving his hands. He yelled "wait" a few times, but I wasn't staying there another second. As I drove away, I watched in the rearview mirror as he ran after my truck for a few seconds before sprinting back to his car. It was clear he wanted me to stop, but there was absolutely no way I was going to do that. I stepped on it, pushing the semi much faster than I should have. I drove for like 5 minutes and started to think I was in the clear, but then I saw headlights fast approaching behind me. I remember feeling more scared than I've ever felt in my entire life. I called the police and told them what happened to the best of my ability. That's when the car was basically right on my tail. It started honking like crazy at me. I honestly didn't know what to do, so I just kept driving, praying to God he wouldn't try and ram me. After like 15 minutes of this, he cut in front of me and hit his brakes, forcing me to slow down. I was just about to crash into him when finally some flashing police lights appeared ahead. The Ford veered off to the right and sped into the desert, disappearing from sight. I pulled over and waited for the officer to show up. I frantically told him what had happened, but the useless cop decided to get a report from me rather than chase the guy down. I was so pissed about that. I told the guy like twice that he could probably catch up to him if he left now. The cop told me not to worry and that they'd do a thorough search as soon as backup arrived. He sent me on my way and said they'd call me if they ever had an update for me. They never did. None of my buddies have a story this crazy, and I've told it more times than I can count. The first know what you're probably thinking: that guy was definitely burying bodies. That doesn't really explain why he had such a small shovel or why he tried to follow me. The bags in his trunk were also too small for that. although some of my buddies think he might have done some dismembering. For my own sanity, I like to think that he was burying some other kind of animal, maybe putting a diseased dog out of its misery or some dangerous snakes. I really have no idea. Either way, I've never been totally comfortable driving through deserts late at night after this experience. Story 2. I've been making deliveries for north of 2 years. Obviously, the only strenuous part of the job is the long hours. You can never truly gauge how the isolation will affect you without experiencing it firsthand. My only advice would be to make peace with whatever demons might be lurking in your subconscious, because they'll definitely eat at your brain in the lonely hours. That's what happened to me. Anyway, this happened to me 3 months after getting employed by my first company. I was basically as new in this trade as one could get. I was driving from southern New Jersey to Lafayette, Indiana, a 12-hour drive. 12 hours driving might not seem that crazy, but factor in the fact that I just completed an 8-hour trip, and that should put things into perspective. I wanted to get deliveries done as quickly as possible, so I opted to drive through the night. I'd get to Lafayette just before 3 a.m. Things were going smoothly. There were virtually no other cars on the road, so I was able to push the semi a little faster than normal. About halfway through the drive, I remember reaching down at the center console to chug a Red Bull, but there weren't any. Of course, I had forgotten to restock my truck after completing my previous delivery. After slapping my dashboard a few times, I groaned in frustration, knowing I'd have to stop somewhere. There was nothing I hated more than having to make stops during my drives. I might be unique in this, but I always get exponentially more tired when my vehicle is immobile, even if I'm only stopped for like 20 seconds. After glancing up at the navigation, I figured I had no choice, either fall asleep on the road or stop and get an energy drink. In my brain, those options were pretty much equivalent. Reluctantly, I pulled into the first service stop I saw. I had literally no clue where I was, probably somewhere in Ohio at this point. Too late, I realized this wasn't actually a service stop. It was what looked like an abandoned gas station and a repurposed convenience store. Not sure if there's any better way to describe it. Either way, it looked like there was another quick stop store not far up the road, so I figured I'd go there if anything. I parked the semi and made my way over to the first convenience store. To be completely honest, I was expecting one of two things to happen: either the place would be open, or the door would be locked. You can imagine my surprise then, when the door swung open into a pitch-black store. I looked around, hoping maybe I'd get lucky and there would be a drink or snack left behind. Just before I was about to turn around, my eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I picked up on a faint glow emanating from the corner of the room. I made my way over to it, and the glow turned out to be coming from a back room of some sort. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the door slowly. To my pleasant surprise, there was a plugged-in refrigerator against the wall. Eagerly, I opened the door but found nothing, literally nothing. The shelves had literally been removed, like the whole appliance had been gutted. As I was shutting the door, I was 90% certain I heard a clatter from the main room, like something hitting the floor. I froze for a good 10 seconds. Had I imagined it? There was no way. Quietly, I walked back into the main room and looked around. Nothing. Part of me wanted to keep investigating, but I didn't have time for this. I walked out the entrance door and basically jogged to the other shop. It was open, thank God. I paid for my drink and made it back to my truck. Something about this whole stop felt wrong. I needed to get back on the road as soon as possible. I took one last glance at the abandoned store and noticed the door was now open. I was 100% positive I had shut it behind me. It wasn't my job to figure out what was going on here, though, so I started the engine and merged my semi back onto the highway. The caffeine started kicking in and snapped me out of my tired haze pretty quickly. My mind began to wander, and I started thinking about how bizarre that whole thing had actually been. I guess a squatter in an abandoned building wasn't the strangest thing in the world, but my brain couldn't explain that refrigerator no matter what theory I thought of. I tried to forget about it and kept driving. It was then that I started noticing weird movements in the curtain behind me. Sweat started dripping down my forehead. I watched in the rearview mirror as the curtain seemed to billow and move, even though I didn't have the air on. I thought the worst, there was someone in my truck. I didn't have any weapons on me or anything, so I discreetly punched in the nearest police station on my phone. The drive there was the most tense and horrifying 20 minutes of my life. I kept imagining that person reaching out to grab me or trying to crash my truck. Finally, I approached the police station. I stopped the semi as close as I possibly could get and basically ran over to the police station. In seconds, my truck was surrounded by police, and after I opened the back, what I saw will stay with me for life. The police pulled out 3 homeless-looking people, 2 men and 1 woman. They were wearing rags and were wrapped in nasty-looking blankets. One of the men was armed with 2 switchblades. All 3 of them refused to talk but stared menacingly at me as they were getting cuffed. I have no idea what they wanted. I don't think I'll ever know. Story 3. When I was about 8, we lived in a small town in Utah. It was a town with a tiny population, and I hated it. Now, I'd probably think it was quaint and charming, but back then it was miserable. We moved there from another part of the state because my dad got transferred. Our house was in the woods, far from any neighborhoods or people. I remember feeling isolated all the time. My parents were very loving and I had a great childhood, but I didn't have any friends close by, and it wasn't easy to make any. Our new house was an old farmhouse. It creaked and groaned a lot, and I would get scared at night from the noises it made. Sometimes I would wake up and swear I heard footsteps in the hallway, but my parents always said it was just the house settling. One night I was in bed, trying to fall asleep, but it was no use. I kept hearing the house creak, and it was getting on my nerves. I threw the blankets off and decided to get a glass of water from the kitchen. I tiptoed down the stairs, not wanting to wake anyone up. When I got to the kitchen, I noticed something strange. The back door was slightly open. I was confused because my dad always made sure it was locked before bed. I figured maybe he had forgotten. As I approached the door, I could feel a cold breeze coming in from outside. I reached out to close it, but before I could, I heard a noise coming from the living room. It sounded like something scratching against the wall. My heart started to race, but I was a curious kid, so I went to investigate. I walked into the living room and froze. There, standing in the middle of the room, was a man. He was tall, with long, messy hair and dirty clothes. He was facing away from me, scratching the wall with his nails. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. I just stood there, paralyzed with fear. The man suddenly stopped scratching and slowly turned around. His eyes were wild, and he had a crazed look on his face. He smiled at me, and I could see he was missing several teeth. I finally found my voice and let out a blood-curdling scream. My dad came running down the stairs, and the man bolted out the back door. My dad chased after him but didn't catch him. We called the police, but they never found him. After that night, I had trouble sleeping for a long time. Every time I heard the house creak, I would jump, thinking the man was back. We eventually moved out of that house, but the memory of that night stayed with me. Even now, as an adult, I get uneasy when I hear strange noises in the middle of the night. Story 4. My name is Kevin. I've been a trucker for various companies for the better part of 15 years now. Things have become pretty routine at this point. I pick up the goods and materials, verify them for accuracy, and deliver them as instructed. We're not paid by the hour, so efficiency is the most important thing in this line of work. For someone like me who's been doing this forever, I like to think I can outwork all these young guns that are snapping these jobs up. This isn't always great, though, because I usually push myself to the absolute limit when it comes to functioning on barely any sleep. 4 years ago, I was working for a warehouse based in North Dakota. For anyone who doesn't know, North Dakota is one of the flattest states, which makes trucking a little easier. This also meant that skipping out on a few hours of sleep could mean the difference between employment and getting the sack. It was a chilly Tuesday morning in May. The beginning of the week meant that more loads needed to be shipped, which meant more work for me. I wanted to knock it all out in one shot, so I traced my route into Montana accordingly, planning on not stopping even once to sleep. I hit the road a few hours after lunch, expecting to reach my destination very early the next morning. I pushed the semi as much as possible, doing maybe a couple over the speed limit. It was getting late, and I remember rubbing the crust from my eyelids as the clock ticked past midnight. I was having trouble keeping my eyes open, but I only had about an hour left in this drive, so I gritted my teeth and kept going. My buddy Tristan, who was also a trucker, introduced me to smelling salts when I first started out. If you don't know, smelling salts are basically some kind of crystals in a little bottle. One sniff, and you're wide awake. You have to be careful, though. Too many back-to-back uses could be dangerous, or at least that's what Tristan told me. They burn your nose a little bit, but whenever I needed a boost, I'd reach for the smelling salts first. This was one of those times. I took a big whiff and shot my head back, my reflexes taking over. I felt the adrenaline course through my body, and I hoped the feeling would last the rest of the drive. A half hour shot by and I was really struggling. I felt myself start to doze off, and the blare of my truck drifting into the shoulder jolted me awake. This was getting dangerous, I thought. I had to pull off. I was all alone on the highway, but there was nowhere to pull off. There was just woods on either side of me. I slowed the truck down, searching desperately for somewhere to pull over. At this low speed, my headlights pierced through the darkness, and I was able to see a lot more. As I looked around, I saw something that confused me. There was a purple dress lying in the middle of the road. What the hell, I thought, rubbing my eyes. Was I hallucinating? I blinked like 6 times just to make sure I wasn't going crazy. It was real. I approached the dress with my truck and stared at it as I rolled by. In hindsight, this should have been more of a red flag, but I think I was just too exhausted to process what was going on. About 200 or so yards away, I passed a pair of shoes. Now I was starting to freak out. What the hell was going on? I passed the shoes, praying to God there would be a place to pull off soon. My old man David was a super religious guy, so I clutched his old cross and hoped he would come through for me. A little further up the road, I saw a bunch more random clothing, some of which looked like little kids' clothing. This time I stopped the truck. The panic started to set in. Something was very, very wrong. I sat in the driver's seat with the truck at a standstill. I was expecting something to happen, but it never did. So I did what my instincts told me to do. I stepped out of the truck and went to inspect the clothing. I still remember the feeling of the chilly morning air piercing my skin, which definitely helped my exhaustion. I approached the pile as cautiously as I could. It was indeed kids' clothing. It looked like there were both boy and girl pieces of clothing in the pile. I looked around into the woods, but I couldn't see much of anything in the darkness. I had my head on a swivel, worried that this was some kind of trap. I decided it was not my business to figure out what was going on, so I made my way back to my truck. Just then, I heard a crunch from the left. I whipped around, trying to see what was there. I stood there, waiting to hear another sound. After about 30 seconds, there was another crunch, but this time from the opposite side of the road. My survival instincts kicked in and I sprinted towards the truck. I jumped into the front seat, but just before I slammed the door, I heard a child's scream ring out. I froze, my heart bursting out of my chest. I was caught in a crossroads. I wasn't going to fight some random people in pitch-black woods, but I couldn't just abandon some helpless kids either. Before I could make a decision, another almost identical child's scream rang out. Without thinking, I turned the truck on and pointed its nose toward the spot in the woods where I heard the noise. My headlights lit up about 30 yards into the woods. There were 3 or 4 people, one of whom was holding a massive speaker. They ducked behind a couple of trees as my truck lit them up, but I had exposed them for just enough time to make out what they were doing. They hid from the light before I could really make out any distinctive features. But I swear on my old man David's grave they were holding up a speaker, trying to lure me into the woods with a fake kid screaming. I was just in shock. I just sat there staring at the trees those people had just hidden behind. I reached for my phone to call the police, but before I finished dialing, I heard a thump from the body of the truck. Someone had thrown something from the other direction. I was done. I turned back to face the road and slammed on the gas. As I sped off, I could make out a person on the other side of the road. He shouted something I couldn't understand before launching something at the truck that cracked the glass of my passenger side window. I drove the final hour in silence. I was too scared to process what had just happened, but there was no way in hell I was stopping to sleep in those woods. I completed my delivery and then knocked out. I must have slept for 10 hours straight. When I woke up, the first thing I did was call the police, who told me they'd investigate those woods and give me any updates. I then thought about the whole thing and how stupid I was to get out of my truck. I should have just minded my own business, but the thought of some kids being kidnapped or worse was just too much for me to ignore. To this day, I still have no idea what those people were trying to do. I don't know why they didn't just rush me when they had the chance, or what they were planning to do to me if I ran out in the woods after the kids screaming. In all my years of being a trucker, nothing has ever come close to being as strange or downright terrifying as this experience. Story 5. My great aunt was a wonderful woman, full of joy and life. She had a very bright and friendly personality. She was one of those people who would always go out of their way to make you feel welcome, happy, and satisfied. I loved her very much. We were close despite the fact that she lived 2 states away, and we didn't get to see each other very often. One day, out of nowhere, my mom got a call from the local police. Apparently, a neighbor hadn't seen her in a few days and called the police for a wellness check. They found her dead in her home. My mom and I were devastated by the news. We packed up the car and drove down there immediately. On the way, my mom and I called her neighbor to get more information. The neighbor told us that my great aunt was still smiling when they found her. It was like she had accepted her fate and left the world with a smile on her face. I found it odd but kind of nice that she went peacefully. When we arrived at her house, we were greeted by a woman who claimed to be one of her close friends. She was crying and kept telling us how much she would miss her. After talking for a while, she left and we went inside. The house felt different. It was as if it knew that its owner was no longer there. It felt colder, emptier, and almost eerie. We started looking through her things, trying to decide what to keep and what to donate. As we were going through her belongings, we found a box full of old photographs and letters. Most of them were from when she was younger, but some were from the last few years. We decided to take the box with us and look through it later. That night, we stayed in her house. My mom took her bedroom and I took the guest room. As I was trying to fall asleep, I kept hearing strange noises. It sounded like someone was walking around the house. I thought it was just my mom, so I didn't think much of it. I eventually fell asleep, but I had a strange dream. I dreamt that I was in my great-aunt's house, and she was there with me. She was smiling and laughing, just like she always did. But then her smile started to fade, and she looked worried. She told me that she was scared and that something was coming for her. I tried to ask her what she meant, but she just kept repeating that she was scared. I woke up in a cold sweat and couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next morning, my mom and I decided to start packing up her things. We went through her bedroom first. As we were packing up her clothes, I found a small, locked box under her bed. I asked my mom if she knew what it was, but she had never seen it before. But we decided to open it, and inside we found a collection of old letters and photographs. The letters were from a man named William, who my great-aunt had apparently been in love with many years ago. The photographs were of the two of them together, looking happy and in love. We had never heard of William before, and my mom was shocked to learn that her aunt had been in love with someone that she had never mentioned. As we were looking through the letters, we found one that stood out. It was dated just a few days before my great-aunt had died. In the letter, William wrote that he was coming for her and that they would be together again soon. He told her not to be scared and that he would take care of her. My mom and I were both confused and a little creeped out by the letter. We had no idea who William was or what he meant by coming for her. We decided to do some research and found out that William had died many years ago in a car accident. My great-aunt had been devastated by his death and had never really gotten over it. We realized that she had been waiting for him to come for her all these years. My mom and I were both freaked out by the whole situation, but we decided to try and focus on the happy memories we had of my great-aunt. A few days later, we had her funeral. It was a beautiful service, and many people showed up to pay their respects. As we were saying our final goodbyes, I couldn't shake the feeling that my great-aunt was finally at peace, and that she was with William again. I still think about her often and wonder if she really did find the love and happiness she was waiting for all those years. Story 6. I used to be a trucker, crisscrossing the country so many times that I felt like I knew the land like the back of my hand. I thought I'd seen everything, but I was wrong. Something happened on my last route that makes me feel like I'm either going crazy or witnessed a warning sign for all of us. Not just truckers, but anyone living on this continent. Regardless, I'll never be able to go near that region again. I was heading east on Interstate 40 through the desert of New Mexico on my way to Richmond. I had just left Oxnard the previous day with a load full of produce, a typical route for me, something I've done hundreds of times. It was the start of the second day of my journey. I left the truck stop at about 4:30 in the morning and had been driving for about an hour. It was still dark out and there was almost nobody on the road. I found myself in one of the long, flat, and empty stretches in the middle of nowhere when I suddenly had a tire blow out. It wasn't my first time, so I knew what to do and eased the truck off the road and came to a stop. I was mad about it, as I always made sure my tires were in good condition, but sometimes things just happen. I put my hazards on and got out to put reflectors on the shoulder and inspect the damage to see if it was something I could manage myself or if I would need roadside assistance. As I suspected, the tire was shredded, but I had a spare and everything I needed to change it. I was just about to lose a few hours of time. The night wind was blowing hard and cold. On second thought, I decided that even though I had a big magnetic flashlight, I should just wait for sunrise since it wasn't far off. While I was waiting, I figured I'd have a few cigarettes to calm myself down. I opened my passenger side door to block the wind and sat up on the step, just looking out at the big dark emptiness and all the stars while I had a smoke. It was quiet, immensely quiet. I went through several cigarettes, and when I was done, I flicked the butts into the scropeland. Admittedly, that was irresponsible, but I got my comeuppance. A huge gust of wind came and slammed the door shut right on me. I didn't have time to get out of the way, so I got smacked right in the face. What's worse, I had a lit cigarette in my hand as I tried to stop the door and shield my face, but it just got pushed into my lips and gave me a nasty burn. I shoved the door off of me and stumbled onto the shoulder, kicking and cursing the pain away. Thinking this trip was starting off pretty terribly, another cold blast of wind came from the northeast, seemingly just to add insult to injury. I turned to shake my fist at it for lack of anything else I could do when I saw something on the horizon. It looked like a person, but they were glowing. Otherwise, there's no way I would have been able to see them in the darkness. The sight of them gave me chills. They were standing at the apex of the slight incline I was on, maybe a mile or two away. They were small, but I could still make them out when I squinted. They were actually standing in the middle of the road. I looked on as they raised their hand into the air, holding something up like it was a spear. Then gradually, more people started showing up behind and either side of them, coming to stand with them at the top of the rise, all glowing the same impossible glow. They were all waving objects in the air. There must have been 30 or 40 of them in all. Finally, it became obvious that they were threatening me with their weapons, spears, axes, and bows. In this moment I felt frozen. An immense roar erupted from the army as they all charged forward at once. Whatever distance between us was about to be cleared in a matter of minutes. Their speed was unnatural, almost supernatural. Panicking, I felt the only thing I could do was climb in my cab and hide. But when I climbed up and tried to open the door, I had somehow locked myself out and my keys were still in the cab. I kicked myself for being so dumb, but nothing was stopping this army of phantoms from running towards me. I turned back to face them, figuring if I died, I wouldn't die running or hiding. I would just face my demise head on. Within moments, they were just seconds away. They sped across the land like the wind itself, wailing battle cries and ready to tear me apart with their primitive weapons. My epiphany came in the last moments. These were lost souls of the Native Americans who died defending this land, which meant everything to them but nothing to me, just an endless expanse of dust and shrubs to pave a road across and drive through without even stopping to appreciate it. I almost thought I deserved it. Even if I didn't do the killing or the paving, I did the driving over their graves over and over again. I wondered why they blew out my tire. But then God arrived with the rising sun, and as the first light of the day touched their hollow glow, they all evaporated into thin desert mist, the wispiest morning dew in existence. The gust of wind charged right through me, and I was almost swept off my feet. I stood there in awe, watching the desert sunrise until a truck came rushing by and broke me from my trance. For the first time at that moment, I thought to myself, what a god-awful noise that is. Story 7. As a female trucker, I have to take extra precautions on the road. If I let my guard down for even a few seconds, I could end up seriously hurt. I don't say this hypothetically. Once, while I was stopped at a rest area doing some routine checks on my vehicle, I thought I caught a glimpse of a shady-looking man wandering around the truck parking lot. I didn't think much of it because I was getting ready to leave very shortly. So after I made sure everything was good to go, I hopped into my cab and locked the doors, thinking I was safe. I took a minute or two to look through my phone and queue up a podcast before getting on the road. Then I was off. Everything was business as usual for the next few hours until I was ready for a fill-up. I rolled into the station and started pumping diesel into my driver's side tank, still completely unaware that anything was amiss. But then, while I was on the other side, laying out my passenger side tank, I thought I heard the sound of my door opening and closing. I stopped fueling and checked around, even peeking my head inside to see if anyone was in there. I didn't see anything. I shrugged it off and told myself I better be more diligent about locking my doors, even when I step out just to fill up. Then I went back to my business. After filling up, I went inside the store for a bite to eat and to use their bathroom for number 2, and then I got back on the road. Everything was fine until a few miles down the highway. I felt a cold, sharp blade press against my throat, and a dirty hand put my neck in a vice grip. My heart sank to the floor, and suddenly I couldn't see anything but what was straight ahead. Then a man's voice spoke to me. "Turn off your radio and pull over," he whispered in my ear. Until I could figure out what I could possibly do, I did as he said. I couldn't call for help from my radio, and I couldn't reach for my phone in my pocket. It wouldn't do any good to start swerving. There was something in the cab that would help me, but I had to figure out a way to get it. I tried to think while I pulled off onto the shoulder and put on my hazards like I was having mechanical issues. Once I parked, the man grabbed my face and forced me to look at him. That's when I realized he was the sketchy guy I saw at the last rest area. He was even grosser up close, but he was also clearly hell-bent on getting to me. He must have climbed under my cab and held on for over 200 miles, then snuck inside and hid while I was at the pump. Now that he thought he was finally going to get what he wanted, he ordered me to do as he commanded. "Climb into the bunk with me and don't try anything. I need you to be alive. You just need to be warm," he said with a sickening grin. It made shivers go through my whole body, and I almost threw up in his face, but I didn't. He grabbed my arm with his free hand and kept the knife close to my throat as he started to drag me up to the bunk. I knew there was a step getting into it, so while I was still a foot lower than him, I made my move. I grabbed his hand with the knife and I wrenched it away to keep him from cutting me as I plunged a foot into his groin, then yanked him by the arm to throw him over my head. At the last moment, I turned to the side and kicked him away, sending him reeling into the driver's seat floorboard while I landed in the passenger seat. Before he could get up, I opened my glove box and grabbed my 9mm, which was loaded and ready to go the second I switched off the safety. I know it's illegal, but it's the only thing that saved me that night. I pointed it right at him and told him to get the hell out of my truck. He refused to drop the knife, but he put his hands up and started to climb out the door. I followed him to close the door behind him, but as I was pulling it shut, he turned around and grabbed it at the last second. I fell back into the seat, dropping the 9mm on the floorboard because I instinctively went to hold the door with both hands. He latched into a tug-of-war, which I knew he might just win. That's when an interesting idea occurred to me. I let go completely and kicked the door open. The man lost his grip and flew back toward the road, but he never hit the ground. A car was speeding by at that exact moment, and the attacker crashed right into the innocent bystander's windshield. It all flashed before my eyes in a split second, and I got up to watch the car careen off the road and thankfully come to a stop without any other collisions. The attacker was minced meat on impact, and the driver of the vehicle, a 20-something guy, was really shaken up. He was probably pretty traumatized, come to think of it. But when I told him that he hit a scumbag and not a regular trucker, he seemed to be okay with it. Unfortunately, I lost my whole job over this crap, and I ended up unemployed through all of the lockdown. I'm still trying to find another company to get a new transportation contract, but it's been difficult with my record. My family says I should get a job that's not trucking, something safer, but I don't think I want to let this ruin my career. I've been a trucker for 15 years and I've only had this one slip up. It didn't even have to do with trucking, it was just because some creep thought I was vulnerable. Story 8. When I started out trucking, an old-timer I met at Love's once told me to never tell anybody what I was hauling, no matter how valuable. I thought he was just old and paranoid, as I'd never really heard of truck robberies being a realistic issue. But I shouldn't have taken the old man's wisdom for granted. I had only been trucking for a few years, and I really loved doing it. Now I'm pretty much barred from trucking for the rest of my life unless I manage to save up enough money somehow to buy my own instead of renting under a contract. My series of errors began when I started driving through the middle of the night to avoid traffic and have a smoother ride. People always told me that was all good until I broke down at 2 a.m. in the middle of nowhere, but I discovered it leaves you more vulnerable for more than that reason alone. One night I was taking a break at one of the sketchiest rest stops I've ever been to. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning, and I needed to take a rest before going on any further, but I didn't expect this place to suck as much as it did. It almost looked abandoned, and there was barely anyone stopped there. I should have had the sense to just roll on through and take the next stop, but I didn't feel like it. I parked and pissed and shut my eyes for a few minutes. Then I spotted a vending machine in the building, and I wanted to check it out, maybe get a snack or a coffee or something. I was looking for something to buy when a man came out of the bathroom and approached me. He looked like he was in some kind of biker gang with the obvious leather jacket and tattoos. "Don't bother," he said. "They're all busted." "Oh, well, I don't really need any of it anyway," I said. Then, the man reached into his jacket and my heart jumped for a second. But instead of pulling out a weapon, he pulled out a flask and offered it to me. "This is what you really need, isn't it?" he asked. "Oh no, thanks. Had a client, I have to get back on the road." "Suit yourself," the man shrugged and took a swig from the flask. "Well then, good night," I said as I turned around and started walking back to my truck. The man didn't follow me, but he didn't accept that I wanted the conversation to be over. "That's your truck out there," he hollered. I stopped and pivoted back to look. "Yep," I replied. "What are you hauling?" he asked. At that moment, I remembered what that old-timer had told me not to let anyone know if you've got something valuable in your trailer. I stammered for an instant, looking for a lie that would sound true. "Oh, just some toilet paper," I finally hollered back. "Just toilet paper," how the man chuckled and smirked, and just by the look on his face, I knew he could tell I was lying. "That ain't worth as much as it used to be," he added. Yeah," I said awkwardly, turning back around and walking back to my truck. "Safe travels," then I heard the man say over my shoulder. I climbed into my truck and got moving immediately. I had a bad feeling about this whole thing, and I knew that I might be reacting too late, but I had to get a move on either way, because I was lying. I wasn't hauling toilet paper, I was hauling various medicines for a pharmaceutical plant, many of which would go for a lot of money on the black market: opioids, amphetamines, or in this country, even insulin. Unfortunately, I think the speediness of me getting out of there might have given away that I was hauling something that was worth stealing. I wasn't even fully merged onto the highway before a motorcycle raced up in front of me and started brake-checking me. I could tell from the jacket that it was the guy I'd been talking to, but now his face was covered. He took me for the kind of guy that wouldn't hit him and risk killing him, and he was right. I slowed down, and before I knew it, I was surrounded by cars on the left side of me, pushing me onto the shoulder. I kept going, even on the rough pavement, and then for a second I thought I might get a break. The bike in front of me moved out of the way, but then a second later, an old beat-up white van took its place and slammed on the brakes. I struck the van, and in a moment of rage, I decided to go full throttle and push the thing out of my way. However, when I looked out my driver's side window, the man on the bike was riding alongside the SUV that was blocking me in, and he was pointing a gun right at me. Panicked, I jerked the steering wheel to the left, causing the SUV and the biker to flinch, but they didn't let up. Suddenly, the biker fired his gun. The bullet went over the SUV and right through my window, lodging somewhere in the ceiling, but thankfully it missed me. Right about then, The passenger in the SUV leaned out of the window with a shotgun. It fired at my front wheels, blowing it out instantly. By now I knew I'd be killed if I didn't stop, so I finally gave up. I stopped and put my hands up, knowing what was about to go down was not going to be pretty. In seconds, they were slamming the cab and screaming at me to open the doors, or they'd force their way in and kill me. All of them were masked, so their identities were fully concealed, so I knew there was no point in trying to get a good description of any of them. I obeyed and unlocked the doors. I was yanked out by the biker and thrown to the ground. I caught a glimpse of my dash camera being destroyed before the beating started. Several of them went at me with clubs, brass knuckles, and boots. I tried to protect my head with my arms and hands, but I couldn't withstand it for very long until I went unconscious. That's the last thing I remember, being beaten to an absolute pulp. I woke up in the hospital a few weeks later, with everyone around me saying they thought I wasn't going to make it. I had a broken skull, shattered orbital, missing teeth, a broken jaw, cracked ribs, punctured lung and internal bleeding, and a whole universe of bruises and lacerations. They say I was found in a ditch by a passerby at dawn, a whole 3 hours later. The doctor said if it had been another hour, I would have died from swelling in my brain or suffocated on my own blood. It's truly a miracle that I survived. However, the police investigation never got far, unfortunately. The gang drove the truck on the flat tire to a clearing in the woods by the highway, rummaged through the cargo from cover, took everything of value, and left it there and fled. Suspects were identified based on fingerprints and my recollection of events, but the gang is still at large. They could be anywhere in the country at this point. Recovery was and continues to be a long and difficult road for me, and of course I had to file for bankruptcy because of the medical debt because, yeah, I'm not paying that.